In the 1990s, the Soviet Union's GDP was growing. The economy was ranked second, depending on who you ask. But then in 1991, there was no Soviet Union.
Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev has been removed from power.
Now, Vladimir Putin thinks the Russian economy is doing great.
This is an amazing result. It seems that we are being strangled and crushed from all sides. But we have become the first country in Europe in terms of economic volume.
So does the International Monetary Fund.
Now, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world, yet this year its economy is set to grow faster than all advanced economies, according to the International Monetary Fund.
But 22% of Russians don't have indoor plumbing. 67% of rural Russians don't have indoor plumbing. And Russian casualties are expected to hit 1 million by the end of the year. But who cares, right? The Russian economy grew 3.6% in 2023. So now every pro-Russian expert and their mom is loudly and proudly saying that sanctions are not working. They claim that Putin is winning this war, while the other side is arguing that numbers are fake. But in this argument, everyone seems to be forgetting an important truth. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has accelerated a geopolitical realignment that will define the first half of the 21st century. This realignment will affect everyone, from world leaders to average people. For more than 2 years, Western policymakers have been trying to answer two very important questions. Why aren't Western sanctions having the impact they expected? And if sanctions aren't the effective geopolitical tool we thought they were, well then what? I was interested in exploring the same questions, so I made this video. In part 1, I'll explain what sanctions are and how they've been used throughout history. In part 2, I'll give a quick overview of the main sanctions applied since Russia invaded Ukraine. And finally, in part 3, I'll talk about the reasons Russia has been able to keep fighting the war despite the sanctions. Some of those reasons are because of inherent problems with sanctions, while others are unique to Russia. This is the most detailed video you'll watch about the impact of Western sanctions on the Russian economy. And it's about to start right now. Now, any criticizing Russia is bombarded with dislikes from bots from Russia. But this video is directly calling out Putin and his lies. I'm sure Russian bots are not going to be happy with this. So if you can please do me a favor and hit the like button below. It helps us out a lot. There are 3 unique reasons why Russia has seemingly shrugged off Western sanctions. The first one is what I'll call the dependence gap. The second is the globalization gap, and the third is the determination gap. Before I talk about each of them in depth, I'll explain what sanctions are and what they're supposed to do. Sanctions are penalties applied to sovereign states or multilateral organizations like the United Nations against other states, groups, or individuals. Generally speaking, sanctions work in 2 ways. Either they're supposed to apply enough pressure on a targeted regime to change its behavior, or they're supposed to put enough pressure on the society underneath to rise up and topple the regime. Sanctions started out as very broad measures that usually affected entire groups. Today, however, they're usually more targeted. As a result, sanctions today come in a wide range of forms, including trade barriers, asset freezes, travel bans, arms embargoes, and restrictions on financial transactions. They're like a geopolitical all-you-can-eat. Okay, so those are the absolute basics. The next questions. How have sanctions actually been used? And which countries have actually used them the most? These questions are important because they'll help us understand how governments and organizations have used sanctions as a diplomatic and economic weapon. The concept of using sanctions as a tool for punishing or deterring adversaries has been around since ancient Greece. However, it wasn't until the early 19th century, during the Napoleonic Wars, that they were used at scale. Emperor Napoleon desperately wanted to defeat the British, who were the main funders and supporters of anti-French alliances. But he simply couldn't defeat the mighty Royal Navy. So he hatched another plan. At the time, the British depended on trade with the rest of Europe for its prosperity. Napoleon knew that because the Royal Navy controlled the seas, he couldn't enforce a blockade. But he also knew that if he succeeded in preventing trade from ports under his control, then France would prevent British products from landing in the first place. This form of economic coercion was a specific type of sanction known as a blockade. And although in the end the continental blockade didn't have the impact that Napoleon was hoping for, it still ushered in a new era of economic warfare. Sanctions became a recognized feature of international law when they were enshrined in the founding documents of the League of Nations. When U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, one of the League's architects and main advocates, was urging Americans to support the creation of the League, he explicitly made the argument that he saw sanctions as a substitute for war. "A nation boycotted is a nation that is in sight of surrender," he said in 1919. Apply this economic, peaceful, silent, deadly remedy, and there will be no need for force. It is a terrible remedy. For 4 years, the world watched on in horror as millions of young men were cut down by new weapons of war. Just as the march of technological progress made those weapons, artillery, poison gas, bombing aircraft, the march of political and diplomatic progress created new tools of diplomacy. Tragically, however, the League of Nations failed in its mission. Less than 20 years after it was created, Nazi Germany invaded Poland and Czechoslovakia. The world fell into war once again. Beyond its unimaginable human cost, World War II also created a new global order. Into the power vacuum left by Europe's retreat stepped two superpowers. On one side, representing capitalism and democracy, the United States. On the other side, flying the iron banner of socialism, the Soviet Union. The US, which already had experienced using trade sanctions as a means of regulating world politics, wasted no time in imposing tough sanctions against its new rival. The Export Control Act of 1949 restricted the export of strategic materials and equipment to Soviet bloc nations. Originally, it was intended as just a temporary measure, but the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 drew sharp battle lines. Capitalism and socialism locked horns in the massive ideological confrontation known as the Cold War, and the US turned toward sanctions. There were two reasons why. The first was its rapidly growing economic power. World War II didn't have any winners, but the US fared better than every other major power. It lost a relatively small share of its population, its cities and infrastructure remained intact, it massively scaled up its industrial manufacturing capability, and after the war, it welcomed millions of new migrants while also gaining the leverage that came with the funding of the reconstruction of Western Europe. The US's newfound power meant that, for the first time, the country supplied a significant share of the world's foreign aid. It didn't take long to learn that stopping the flow of that aid, or at least threatening to, was a good way to apply economic pressure. The second factor which made the sanctions an appealing substitute for military force was the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Before talking about that, did you guys see that Ronaldo just got 50 million subscribers in a week on a brand new channel? Tom Brady just launched a channel and got millions. Every celebrity is looking to start a channel. And that's because YouTube just overtook Netflix in terms of time spent on TV. YouTube is the new TV, the new Hollywood, and the new Netflix. In fact, YouTube is growing so fast that YouTube's CEO publicly said they don't have enough creators to fill the demands of viewers. That means it's the easiest it has ever been for a new creator to blow up. Just look at these channels that were started last year. They have gotten millions of views and made thousands of dollars from them. Best of all, there's no face attached to the channel, meaning the owner was able to build an audience without giving up his privacy, much like this channel. So, if you're someone who's interested in doing the same, we've launched a completely free 7-day email bootcamp on how to start and grow a faceless YouTube channel. If that's something you are interested in, you can sign up now for free by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code that's on the screen. All right, now let's get back to the topic at hand. Suddenly, nations commanded arsenals that could destroy the entire world in a matter of minutes. That kind of destructive potential made the risks of an actual shooting war incredibly dangerous. Blunt force was off the table. So instead, the US tried a mix of carrots and sticks to achieve its ultimate geopolitical objective: weakening the Soviet Union. The US's use of sanctions in the Cold War reflected three popular use cases for sanctions in general. Legislation like the Export Control Act was designed to directly undermine the Soviet economy. Sometimes, like in the case of Cuba, where the communist guerrilla Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed regime, sanctions were used to destabilize Soviet allies that were seen as threatening American interests. And other times, like in the case of the Eastern Bloc countries like Poland and Romania, The United States government imposed less stringent embargoes in the hopes of driving a wedge between the Soviet Union and its allies. At this point, you might be wondering why I'm talking about the US here. Firstly, when it comes to sanctions, the US is king. No other country has applied more sanctions or applied them more often. Secondly, during the Cold War, European nations were much more reluctant to actually apply sanctions on the Soviet Union. Partially, that's because Europe wasn't as strongly anti-communist in terms of its ideology, but mostly it's because Europe was more dependent on the Soviet Union economically, which meant that they were more vulnerable to potential retribution. This is an important dichotomy that we will talk about more later. American aggression, European reluctance. But for now, let's continue with the story. The US imposed sanctions on China, North Korea, and North Vietnam to try and contain the spread of communism in Asia, and a wide range of sanctions against Latin American countries to keep communism away from its backyard. The collapse of the Soviet Union kicked off a huge debate about the role played by sanctions. Unsurprisingly, former Reagan administration officials argued that sanctions drove the Soviet Union to collapse. Academics, on the other hand, they weren't so convinced. Today, the consensus is that while Western sanctions did succeed in denying the Soviets access to some arms and key strategic technologies, the USSR collapsed because its system rotted away from the inside. Just like World War II 45 years earlier, the end of the Cold War ushered in a new era, and a new hope about what sanctions could achieve. With the Soviet Union now a historical footnote, and the newly independent Russian state enduring a series of political and humanitarian crises, no country or ideology could match up to the United States. The US converted its status as the undisputed hegemon into a massive peace dividend. Increased economic growth and cuts to defense spending allowed the US government to actually pay off its debt. Times were good. It felt as though, in the words of the American political scientist Francis Fukuyama, the US was experiencing the end of history. US leaders had no intention of getting involved in an actual war. But they could also see that there were still many security and humanitarian challenges which required their attention. Leaders were still committing atrocities against other groups, even against their own people. American leaders sensed an opportunity to respond to those situations, and in the process, make the rest of the world look more like the US: democratic, developed, and, just as importantly, capitalist. So, despite being in peacetime, the United States started leaning more heavily on the use of sanctions as a foreign policy instrument. Often in conjunction with multilateral organizations like the United Nations and the World Trade Organization, US leaders imposed sanctions on countries it deemed rogue states, such as Iraq, Yugoslavia, and Zimbabwe. Here we see other players at work, so I want to quickly back up and talk about the role of the United Nations. Because while the US is the undisputed leader when it comes to sanctions, the UN has also played an important role in the story. And they're a key part of understanding why it's been hard to nail down Russia with effective sanctions since its invasion of Ukraine. Since 1966, the UN Security Council, the body of the UN tasked with maintaining international peace and security, has established 31 sanction regimes against a number of states and non-state actors. Countries, dictators, and terrorists have all been targeted. But if you look through the list of sanctioned targets, there's one country that's conspicuously absent. The UN Security Council never imposed sanctions on the Soviet Union, and it's never imposed sanctions on Russia. It's because Russia, just like the Soviet Union before it, is one of 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council were all allies in the Second War, and they were the first 5 states to acquire nuclear weapons. Each member of the P5, as it's known, has a veto, which can prevent the adoption of any substantive draft Security Council resolution, regardless of how much support it has from the other members. So it doesn't matter what Russia does. Its veto power means that it will never face the threat of UN sanctions. Instead, the burden of responsibility has fallen to individual states and other multilateral entities like the European Union. Even though the 1990s were the apex of US power, they also demonstrated some of the inherent problems with sanctions. Iraq is a great example. After Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded the neighboring country of Kuwait, the UN Security Council quickly imposed a comprehensive trade embargo on Iraq. The sanctions totally devastated Iraq's economy. They cut the GDP in half. But they still failed to achieve their goal. compelling Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait. Only the Gulf War could do that. After the war, sanctions against Iraq were eased. But the humanitarian damage had already been done. Infant mortality rates skyrocketed, and the country's per capita income flatlined. It was because of sanctions like that, as the 1990s progressed, the international community started asking questions about who sanctions really affected. They didn't stop Saddam Hussein. Instead, they hurt the Iraqi people, who didn't bear any responsibility for the invasion. In response, policymakers began devising more precisely targeted sanctions that actually hit the leaders of sanctioned countries where it hurt. A few factors made this concept feasible. The main one was the homogeny of the US dollar. Because of its economic power and its leading role in the construction of the post-World War II financial system, lots of countries, particularly unstable ones, were dependent on US dollars. So, beginning in the late 1990s and accelerating after 9/11, the US government made it harder for banks and other financial transactions to supply sanctioned governments, organizations, and individuals with US dollars. Those banks need US dollars to function. So the mere threat of being denied access to them makes them highly reluctant to work with sanctioned entities, which effectively locked those entities out of the global financial system. You might have thought that the increased efficacy and potency of smart sanctions would make the US and other Western powers more reluctant to use them. Quite the opposite. In fact, sanctions quickly became the go-to solution for almost every foreign policy problem. During Barack Obama's first term as president, the United States designated an average of 500 entities for sanctions per year for all sorts of reasons, ranging from human rights abuses to nuclear proliferation to violations of territorial sovereignty. That number, already pretty high, almost doubled over the course of Donald Trump's presidency. In his first few months in office, Joe Biden imposed new sanctions on Myanmar, Nicaragua, and Russia, the later for malicious cyber activities. He also directly sanctioned some Saudi Arabian officials involved in the assassination of dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi. There were some high-profile wins. In response to a tightening of sanctions by the Obama administration, Iran agreed to restrict the development of its nuclear program. When Donald Trump threatened to raise tariffs unless Mexico reduced the flow of Central American migrants, the Mexican government deployed the National Guard to stop them. But in general, US sanctions haven't been all that successful. For every success, if you can even call it that, it felt like there were at least two failures. The US imposed harsh sanctions for years on countries like Cuba, Syria, Zimbabwe, and Belarus, for very little return. Donald Trump's maximum pressure campaigns against Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela may have paralyzed their economies, but they didn't yield any meaningful concessions. Sustained sanctions against other major powers didn't change their behavior, and in some cases, simply led to escalation. Targets of US sanctions have resisted. They've adapted. They've retaliated. But they haven't given in. Despite that, America's leaders and the leaders of international organizations have persisted. And they've persisted despite the presence of an uncomfortable truth, one that's right at the heart of the story. The reason sanctions have gone from being just one of the tools at the disposal of Western governments to sometimes looking like they're the only one is because of the relative decline of Western power. The international system was bipolar during the Cold War, and unipolar in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. Today, it's multipolar. Russia, China, India, and the EU have all emerged as formidable geopolitical actors. Economically, politically, militarily, the West is no longer the only game in town. Vladimir Putin could see the tectonic plates of the international system shifting. He knew Western leaders had no appetite for actual war, and that sanctions simply weren't strong enough to dissuade highly motivated great powers. Even though the international system looked relatively calm, a storm was coming. Putin bided his time, prepared his economy and his military, and then, when the time was right, he made his move. Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, was a shocking moment, but it wasn't an unexpected one. Russian and Belarusian troops had been gathering at Ukraine's eastern and northern borders for weeks. And the reality is that by that point, a war between Russia and Ukraine had already been simmering for 8 years. It all dated back to February 2014, and a revolution whose spark was lit, ironically, by the threat of economic pressure. A miracle didn't happen, and the European Union leaders and Ukraine have, as expected, failed to sign an historic free trade deal after a last-minute U-turn from Kyiv. Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych, still attended the Eastern Partnership Summit in Vilnius, but under economic pressure from Moscow. He revived trade talks with Russia, and nothing the EU said could make him change his mind. Ukraine has always been vital to Russian and Soviet interests. It contributed massive amounts of grain, coal, and steel to the Soviet Union. Russian Tsars spent their summers on the beaches of the Crimean Peninsula, which was also the location of a major naval port. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine's strategic value, as a country on the Black Sea which shared borders with numerous future NATO members, was immense. One of the core beliefs of Russian nationalism is that Ukraine is actually a part of Russia. One of those Russian nationalists is Vladimir Putin. He believed Ukraine's independence was a massive blow to Russian prestige and power, and an historical error that needed to be rectified before it came under Western influence. His opportunity came in 2010, with the election of Viktor Yanukovych as Ukraine's president. Although he initially tried to assure Ukrainians that he wanted the country to remain neutral between Russia and the West, Yanukovych quickly vowed to improve relations with Russia, even passing a bill forbidding Ukraine's membership of any military bloc. But in 2013, Ukraine's parliament overwhelmingly approved a free trade agreement with the European Union. It looked like closer ties with the West were within reach. But then, just a week before the summit where the agreement was supposed to be signed, Putin began dialing up the pressure by restricting Ukrainian imports. The pressure paid off. Yanukovych made a U-turn. Instead of signing the agreement with the EU, he instead strengthened ties with Russia. Most Ukrainians were outraged. They realized that as long as their government was taking orders from Russia, they could never be truly free. And in order to be free, they needed a revolution. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets across Ukraine. Kyiv's Independence Square became a massive protest site. And when security forces started firing, killing almost 100 of them, they didn't stop. And they won. Yanukovych fled the country and soon resurfaced in Russia. The Ukrainian parliament restored the constitution to its 2004 version, and an interim government signed the EU deal. The events of early 2014 became known in Ukraine as the Revolution of Dignity. But even as Ukraine's future looked bright, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Soldiers began appearing in the southern Ukrainian province of Crimea. The soldiers had no identifying insignia. They wore plain green uniforms, and they came to be known as the Little Green Men. Some of them stormed Crimea's regional parliament. They barricaded themselves inside and they raised the Russian flag over the building. The next day, more of these green uniformed men seized airports in Crimea. Within a couple of weeks, the whole of Crimea was under the control of these Little Green Men. For weeks, Putin denied the Little Green Men were Russian soldiers. He claimed they were just local militia. But eventually, even he had to admit what everyone suspected. That operation eventually became a full occupation and annexation of Crimea. It was the first time a European country annexed territory belonging to another European country in the 21st century. And it was just the beginning. Armed pro-Russian separatists in the province of Donetsk and Luhansk, an area known as the Donbas, soon declared independence from Ukraine. Russia was secretly providing them with weapons and supplies. Within a few months, Ukraine had lost control of the Donbas. In February 2015, Russia and Ukraine signed a series of agreements to end the conflict. But they were never fully implemented. And instead of stopping, the fighting instead congealed into a bloody trench war, with about 75,000 troops facing off along a 350-mile-long front line. It didn't take long before Russia started building a major military presence near its border with Ukraine, including within the state of Belarus. Despite that, Russian officials, most notably Putin himself, repeatedly denied any plans to attack Ukraine. They were lying. On February 21st, 2022, Russia officially recognized the self-proclaimed Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. One day later, Putin said that the Minsk agreements no longer existed and that Ukraine was to blame. 2 days after that, on the 24th, he announced the beginning of a special military operation. I decided to conduct a special military operation. Its goal is the protection of people who, during 8 years, suffer from abuse and genocide from the Kiev regime. Russian soldiers spilled over the Ukrainian border from 3 positions. From the north through Russia's client state, Belarus, from the south through Crimea, and from the southeast through the Donbas. That's the background to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now that we know that, let's talk about the Western response.
So today, I'm announcing the first tranche of sanctions to impose costs on Russia in response to their actions yesterday.
We will present a package of massive and targeted sanctions to European leaders for approval. With this package, we will target strategic sectors of the Russian economy by blocking their access to technologies and markets that are key for Russia.
As I'm writing this, Russia is under more than 16,000 Western sanctions targeting everything, from key industries and institutions to high-profile individuals. There are way too many to list. So here's their greatest hits. February 26, 2022, the United States banned selected Russian banks from the SWIFT financial messaging system and imposed restrictive measures on Russia's central bank. March 3, 2022, the EU banned 7 Russian banks from SWIFT. March 28, 2022, the US banned the import of Russian oil, gas, and other energy. April 8, 2022, the EU banned the import of Russian coal and other solid fossil fuels, as well as banning Russian vessels from EU ports. March 31, 2022, the US imposed new sanctions targeting Russia's technology sector and related efforts to evade existing sanctions. December 3, 2022, the EU and the G7 agreed to cap the price of Russian seaborne crude oil at $60 per barrel. May 19, 2023, the G7 agreed to step up measures to counter the evasion of price caps on Russian oil exports and to prevent Russian banks from evading sanctions by using foreign subsidiaries. December 22, 2023, a U.S. executive order authorized U.S. sanctions on foreign financial institutions found providing services or facilitating major transactions for Russia's military-industrial network. There's a pattern here. The earlier sanctions took big swings at Russia's industries and its financial sector. But recently, they've aimed to cut down on Russia sanctions evasion and punish entities helping Russia evade sanctions. Broadly speaking, Western sanctions were designed to isolate Russia from the global financial system, reduce the profitability of its energy sector, and undermine its military capacity. The sanctions were expansive and comprehensive. They have had some effects. Russia's economy is smaller than it would have been without them, but ultimately they have not made waging the war sufficiently costly for Russia to stop waging it. In that sense, the most important sense, they have failed. But how come? Before I explain why Russia specifically has shrugged off sanctions, I want to quickly discuss some of the inherent flaws with sanctions, Western sanctions in particular. You might have noticed some of them when I was discussing how they've been used in history, but it's worth listing them all. The first big issue with Western sanctions is that they often come with unrealistic demands. Even before Russia invaded Ukraine, sanctions imposed by the US or European Union have often come with demands that are tantamount to wholesale regime change. It's no surprise that authoritarian leaders prefer to endure the pain rather than giving up power. The second issue with Western sanctions is that if the leaders of targeted countries don't think they can ever be lifted, there's no incentive to change behavior. What's the point of complying with Western demands if there's no chance of getting a reward? The third issue is that sanctions need to be imposed by broad coalitions. If they aren't, then the target country, especially if they're a great power, can find enough countries that are still willing to do business with them. The final major issue with Western sanctions is that they're weak against great powers. Countries like China, Russia, and India are big enough to adapt, and their leaders don't want to suffer the prestige loss that comes with making concessions to the West. All right, Now we're finally ready to look at the 3 reasons why Russia specifically has been so good at neutralizing the impact of Western sanctions. The first reason is the dependence gap. For years, dating back to well before the special military operation, Russia's leaders have embarked on a twofold strategy: independence for Russia and dependence for the West. They've achieved this by doubling down on Russia's natural economic advantages while also using diplomacy to sanction-proof their economy. There's no better example of the dependence gap than energy. Russia is a big player in the world's energy markets. It's a top 3 crude oil producer and the world's largest exporter of natural gas. Before the invasion of Ukraine, a huge amount of those fuels flowed through pipelines straight to the European Union. In 2021, the year before the invasion, 45% of the natural gas imported by the EU, the equivalent of 60 million Olympic-sized swimming pools, came from Russia. So it's no surprise that oil and gas revenues made up almost half of Russia's federal budget. Windfall energy export earnings allow Russian leaders to bank hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign currency reserves. At the time of the invasion, Russia had managed to hoard $643 billion, about a quarter of its GDP, in central bank reserves. As far as we know it, about 32% of those reserves were held in euros. Half of that, about 16%, was denominated in US dollars. Another 13% was yuan. The rest was either mostly gold or government bonds. After Russia invaded Ukraine, European leaders aimed to deprive the Kremlin of the money it needed to finance the war effort by severing their energy relationship with Russia. But at least in the short term, the uncertainty created by Russia's invasion and the West's response worked in Russia's favor by pushing up the price of the exact same oil and gas that they depended on. Therefore, Western leaders had to strike a really delicate balance: deprive Russia of its energy revenues without spooking global markets. The easiest way to do the first thing was to simply ban the import of oil and gas from Russia. But not only did that risk upsetting the markets, but it also meant suffering political costs. European leaders knew that if they cut off supplies of Russian energy, lots of their own citizens would be cold and angry. Europe's most powerful country, Germany, was a big part of the problem. For years, Germany's relations with Russia were based on the principle of change through trade. The idea that increasing economic trade with authoritarian countries could improve diplomatic relations and eventually create domestic political change. Before the invasion, Germany was importing 55% of its natural gas from Russia, mostly through the Nord Stream pipelines. That strategy was eagerly encouraged by Vladimir Putin, who wanted European countries to deepen their dependence on Russia. Change through trade failed the moment Russian soldiers invaded Ukraine. In truth, it probably failed the moment that the little green men started stirring up trouble in Donbas, but Germany wasn't the only problem. One of the biggest thorns in the side of European leaders was Hungary's long-serving Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. Orban is Vladimir Putin's best friend in Europe. The two men have a lot in common politically, and as a result, Orban has always pursued close relations with Moscow. Hungary is massively dependent on Russia. It gets about 80% of its natural gas from there. But why does one small country's close ties with Russia matter? They matter because in order to adopt new laws or regulations, the EU needs the unanimous support of members of the European Council, its main executive body. Hungary is a European Council member. And just like every other member, it has veto power. Vladimir Putin knew this from the very beginning, and that's why he took every opportunity to build a friendly relationship with Orban. Hungary got energy, and Russia got a friend that it could count on in difficult moments. A few months after the war began, the European Council unveiled a plan to ban all Russian oil from European markets by the end of 2022. But several countries, including Hungary, objected. Eventually, a last-minute compromise meant the EU embargo excluded Russian oil, which came from pipelines. The compromises made the embargo weaker. But Western leaders weren't deterred in their efforts to remove Russia's major revenue source. In September of 2022, the G7 group of nations, along with Australia, agreed to introduce a price cap on Russian oil exports. Under the price cap, the sale of any Russian oil which involved companies based in the coalition countries had to be sold for under $60. The logic was that Russian oil refineries were dependent, there's that word again, on those EU-based companies for things like shipping, insurance, brokering, and other support services. As a result, Russia would need to accept lower prices for their crude oil and other petroleum products. For a while, the combined effect of the embargo and price cap worked. Russia's economy shrank by more than 2% in 2022. But it didn't take long for the Kremlin to find ways around the price cap, such as the Shadow Fleet. Using a network of shell companies and middlemen, Russian energy firms have bought or leased hundreds of rusty old tankers, bought insurance from Russian companies, and then set them loose on the seas. At one point, the Shadow Fleet was moving as much as 20% of the global oil trade, and propping up Russia's finances. But how? The answer is the second major reason why Western sanctions haven't stopped Russia.
China and Russia announced a new partnership, with China saying it'll back Russia's foreign policy aims and saying it supports Russian demands that NATO halt its expansion. That is seen as an implicit reference to the situation in Ukraine.
We begin with two presidents who want the world to know that they are on the same page. Today, the leaders of China and Russia promised each other deeper ties with, quote, no limits.
Globalization has been an economic and humanitarian miracle that enabled people to attain higher standards of living. But it's also the same mechanism that enabled Russia to sidestep Western sanctions. Let's start with the most important fact. Globalization has shifted the balance of economic power away from the West and towards the East. In the year 2000, the G7 group of countries, the US, UK, Japan, Germany, Italy, France, and Canada, made up 43.5% of global GDP. By 2023, that share had fallen to 29.9%. Over the same stretch of time, China's share of global GDP has gone from less than 5% in 2000 to almost 20% today, while India's has grown to comprise almost 10%. That incredible growth has been underpinned by the liberalization in trade in goods and services. And it was also underpinned, or so Western leaders believed, by a fundamental assumption. Their assumption was that, as people in non-Western countries experienced more economic freedom, they would demand and obtain greater political freedoms. Unfortunately, that turned out to be almost completely wrong. In some respects, the rest of the world has become more Western. People wear Nikes and eat McDonald's pretty much everywhere. But soft power hasn't translated to democratic reforms. China is the best example. Instead of becoming more liberal, it's actually become more authoritarian. Leaders like Deng Xiaoping use the wealth generated by China's entry into the global economy to reassert the country's power and prestige following the ruin of the Mao years. President Xi Jinping has consolidated his power and strengthened the Communist Party's grip on all areas of society and the economy. And far from peacefully coexisting in the international system alongside the West, he's been determined to displace the West, and the United States in particular, as the world's major power. China and the US compete across almost every sphere: economically, militarily, technologically, and diplomatically. China uses diplomacy as a way of cultivating allies, punishing enemies, and supporting nations that fight proxy conflicts with the West. So, when Xi Jinping looks at Vladimir Putin, he doesn't see the same person as most of us do. He sees a vital strategic ally. The two men have built a close strategic alliance based on mutual interests. Xi likes Putin because he aggressively tries to weaken the West by any means necessary, such as by annexing foreign territory, conducting disinformation campaigns, and funding populist political parties. Putin likes Xi because he openly challenges Western dominance, and he's opened the Chinese market for Russian goods and commodities, which gives Russia the money to maintain their destabilization activities. So it's no surprise that when Western leaders tightened restrictions on the import of Russian oil and natural gas, Xi welcomed them. In 2023, China imported 24% more Russian crude oil than in 2022, enough to help Russia displace Saudi Arabia as China's largest crude oil supplier for the year. The deepening relationship between the two countries goes well beyond energy. Beijing has stepped in to supply Moscow with semiconductors and other critical technologies with military applications. Overall trade between China and Russia went up by even more, 26% from 2022. And 90% of that trade is now conducted in Russian rubles and Chinese yuan, compared to just 25% before the invasion. In other words, Xi Jinping isn't just funding Russia's war machine, he's helping to transform Russia's economy so it'll never be dependent on the West ever again. It's not just China either. India has also massively increased its imports of Russian energy. During the 2023-24 fiscal year, India imported an average of 1.64 million barrels of Russian oil per day, a 57% increase from the previous year. India and China aren't doing Russia a favor out of the kindness of their hearts. Being shut out of Western markets has forced Russia to sell its oil at a discount. But finding new buyers has helped the Kremlin offset most of the damage of Western sanctions, while at the same time strengthening ties with important partners. But there's one more component of the globalization gap I want to talk about. A year after the invasion began, the UN General Assembly introduced a resolution condemning Russia and calling for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. 141 countries voted in favor. 7 countries, including Russia itself, voted against. But 32 countries, including China and India, abstained. In a world where the economic power of the West is in decline, sanctions need to be a collective endeavor to be truly effective. The fact that there are so many countries which haven't joined the effort weakens their power. It goes well beyond China and India. Middle Eastern states, Latin American countries, and African nations have all continued to trade with Russia. The brutal reality is that a lot of world leaders just don't care much about Ukraine, at least not enough to endanger their trading relationship with Russia. Some want to be a thorn in the side of the West. Major enforcement gaps remain. If a sanctions regime has holes, sufficiently motivated countries will find them. Globalization and the economic interdependence it created gave rise to the world where Western sanctions were powerful. But over time, it has critically weakened the foundation of sanctions. At the beginning of the war, the International Monetary Fund forecast that the Russian economy would shrink. Yet, in 2023, it actually grew by 2.2%, more than many Western nations. The globalization gap, which allowed Russia to divert its trade to countries which didn't participate in the sanctions campaigns, was a big reason why. But there was still one other reason. Western sanctions haven't had the desired effect on Russia because of the determination of one man, Vladimir Putin. Earlier in the video, I spoke about how one of the founding principles of Russian nationalism is the belief that Ukraine isn't a separate nation. Vladimir Putin believes that so strongly that he published an entire essay about it in 2021. That essay served 2 purposes. Firstly, it was propaganda for a domestic audience, and secondly, it was a warning to the West. This wasn't just business. This was personal, and nothing was going to stop him. The determination gap refers to the fact that there's a gap between the lengths Putin will go to in order to achieve his goals and the lengths that the West will go to achieve theirs. He was incredibly committed to fighting this war. As I'm writing this, it's believed that around 150,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in the war, with another 350,000 injured. And yet, there are no signs of the war ending. Let's look at the rest of the evidence for the determination gap. Exhibit A is simple. Russia invaded Ukraine. Right until Vladimir Putin did it, people didn't think it was possible. Incredibly, US intelligence were able to obtain highly detailed invasion plans. But US allies, including Vladimir Zelensky, were reluctant to believe them. They were laboring under the assumption that millions of other people were, that outside of the Balkans, war in Europe was a thing of the past. Exhibit B, Putin sanction-proofed Russia's economy and laid the groundwork by building relationships with the countries that would help offset the effects of sanctions. I've already talked about this at length, so I won't repeat myself. Exhibit C, the Russian economy is now entirely geared towards fighting the war. This one's really important. I've already spoken about Russia's response to the initial sanctions, which targeted its financial and energy sectors. And I've discussed the massive diversion of trade, especially in vital commodities like energy, to countries that aren't participating in the sanctions and, frankly, don't care about Ukraine. Those are external. But this is about what happened to Russia's domestic economy. Over the course of the war, Russian leaders have systematically deprived civilian sectors of the economy and instead funneled them into military production. Ammunition, artillery, tanks, planes, drones, military pay, in compensation for the dead and wounded soldiers. They're the reason that the Russian economy defied expectations and recorded positive GDP growth in 2023. Spending on health and education has been cut. There are massive shortages of factory workers. Private consumption has decreased by more than a third relative to pre-war levels. Infrastructure is crumbling. Put simply, the war in Ukraine is now the main driver of Russia's economic growth. According to the historian Nicholas Mulder, the Russian government is spending at least 4.5% of its GDP on the military. And if you include expenditures in other parts of the budget, it might be as much as 6 or even 7%. That's more than almost every other country in the world. As a comparison, members of the NATO military alliance have pledged to spend at least 2% of their GDP on their militaries. Thanks to the money it had from oil and gas, Russia had low levels of governmental debt before the war started. But right now, the government is running massive deficits to fund the war effort. Shells, bullets, and tanks help win a war, but they don't help regular people. That brings me to Exhibit D. Russia has already incurred massive costs in terms of blood and treasure. According to the BBC, more than 50,000 Russian soldiers have been killed since the war began, and that's probably an underestimate. Ukraine's armed forces estimate that the Russian military has suffered more than 450,000 casualties in the war, including death and injuries, while U.S. intelligence services say that Russian casualties top 300,000. According to most estimates, every day of the war in Ukraine costs Russia $500 million to $1 billion. And here's the thing, Putin doesn't care. To him, it's all collateral damage. In a democracy, when you don't like what your leaders are doing, you have two options. You can leave, or you can vote them out. Russians are leaving. But they can't vote out Vladimir Putin. He's not subject to normal democratic constraints like the media, the court, or the legislator. And the more conscientious Russians that leave the country, the stronger his grip on power becomes. There's one more component to the determination gap. Exhibit E. The West is nervous. Specifically, it's nervous about the domestic political costs of continuing to support Ukraine. A clear majority of both Europeans and Americans still support aid to Ukraine, but those majorities aren't as clear as they used to be. When war broke out, almost 80% of Americans supported sending economic and military support to Ukraine. 2 years later, those numbers have gone down to 58%. Meanwhile, 55% of EU citizens still support sending weapons to Ukraine, but that's down from where it was. Western political leaders suddenly have to answer to voters who are asking why money is going to Ukraine instead of them, especially during a cost of living crisis. That tension itself motivates Putin to drag out the war, because he knows that Ukraine's ability to continue fighting is predicated on the continuation of Western support. So there you have it. The dependence gap, the globalization gap, and the determination gap. The three major reasons why Russia has managed to avoid the worst impacts of Western sanctions. Okay, so now we know why Russia has been so effective at negating the impact of Western sanctions and continuing the war against Ukraine. But what does the future have in store? Like I said earlier, Russia has slowly but surely gained the upper hand in the war. It has diverted its trade and sacrificed its civilian economy to keep the war machine grinding on. While at the same time, Ukraine's capacity to defend itself and receive support from Western nations appears to be waning. So there are two key questions. If Russia's military overwhelms the Ukrainian military, what will Putin do? And what will be the long-term costs of the war to Russia? The answers are interrelated. Vladimir Putin believes that Ukraine is rightfully part of Russia. That would logically suggest that he might push for a full or at least a partial annexation. But ask anyone involved with the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 and they'll tell you, defeating an army is very, very different to occupying a country. The military victory is the easy part. Actually pacifying a hostile local population, ensuring security, and taking over the institutions of the state? That's the hard part. It takes a lot of men and a lot of money. And Russia is running low on both. This brings me to the second part of the equation. Right now, the Russian economy is only growing because it's fully focused on military production. But go beyond the surface, and there are really big problems. According to estimates, as many as 1 million Russians have left the country since the war started. And they're not just average people either. The people leaving tend to be young, educated professionals. They include more than 50,000 IT specialists and software engineers. No wonder some economists have called the exodus the biggest brain drain since the end of the Soviet Union. A decline in the labor force of that magnitude, along with the fact that Russia's actions have made it an international pariah that has lost a significant amount of economic leverage, will decrease the country's long-term economic and therefore military potential. Don't be surprised if Russia becomes a junior partner in an unequal relationship with China. That's the positive view, from a Western perspective. The negative view is that Putin is showing other authoritarian leaders that if you have a strong enough grip on power, you can adapt to life under sanctions. Ukraine is overflowing with trillions of dollars worth of lithium, titanium, iron ore, coal, and wheat. If Russia conquers it, or at least annexes a significant part of its territory, it will be able to use those resources to rebuild its economy. And Ukraine also offers Russian nationalists something which money just can't buy: prestige and pride. Vladimir Putin has made it his life's work to reassert Russia as a great power on the world stage. For Russia to be a great power, it needs Ukraine. He doesn't care what it costs, and he won't stop. I don't know what the future holds for Ukraine or for Russia, but one thing is certain. Russia has persevered for longer than almost anyone in the West expected. From our perspective here in the West, Russia cannot win the war. But from Russia's perspective, it simply cannot lose.